Hello world of YouTube and welcome to another episode of Redacted, the show where every album has a story. This month, we're keeping it a little more simple in the veins of tying together a project. We're just taking an album that I thought was pretty solid upon release, but after the releasing of a handful of B-sides, I saw potential in making the project at least a bit more consistently solid in my eyes. The cause for covering this album is because the band in question, Rise Against, just released a new album that I'll be talking about in this month's listening log. Spoilers for that. Not just the fact that I'm doing that, but also I kind of like the subject of today's video more than the newest album they released, but I'll get into that more next week. It's an album that saw them trying to keep with it, stay hip for the kids, while also really getting to the point of the problem still plaguing the world, which is so much the MO for the band in question. It is the 9th album from Rise Against that was released in 2021, Nowhere Generation.
We are the Nowhere Generation. We are the kids that know.
Now, the idea of a Nowhere Generation is sort of the permeating energy throughout the amalgamous gray that fueled the art direction for this album. But beneath that sort of cathartic, sort of disenfranchised numbness to the chaos, there is some real issues and some real frustrations that the band does tackle with an edge that I feel like was elevated from the album that it was following up and what ended up following it up. It is a solidly produced record that I think had some songwriting that definitely encroached on, like, Gen X fellow kids' cringiness. Even the title Nowhere Generation, I feel like, is on the lower echelon of towing that line. There were some songs that I left on the cutting room floor that very much evoke that feeling more, even if they sonically sounded pretty solid. And there were other songs that sort of leaned into sounds that I don't think the band tackles, as well as the punkier elements that sort of like set the record back for me. However, like I mentioned in the intro, they dropped an EP of some B-sides, and so I wanted to inject those into the track listing, keep the pace sort of similar as far as like the ebb and flow of the project, but just sort of fine-tune it a bit to make it just, I don't know, sound better across the board, in my opinion. There's a practice in sequencing going on here that I hope sort of gets illustrated properly, because there isn't a real concept to this album. That ebb and flow, I'll get more into the nitty-gritty here in a second, but before I do that, I will show you the track listing to my 12-song, 45-minute version of Nowhere Generation right now.
Is there nothing that can save us now? Is there nothing that can silence to us this whole time? I never wanted to disturb the peace, but it feels like no. I hear the cry of the approaching sirens right as I count down, then something snaps. A light, I've never let a damn thing get to me, but this time it's personal. I'm not gonna say that it's alright, 'cause we both know, yeah, we both, but there's a world that's complicated. Somehow we buried it alive, but we never knew the rules. Bend, follow, or to break, lost in this haze. Be given, never knowing what we're living for. And all we want is something to do. We are the Nowhere Generation. The Nowhere Generation. Oh.
While The Numbers was a solid enough starter on the original, I think The Answer, the first song on the little EP of B-sides, is a better sort of kinetic starter. Both lean into some of that punk energy, but some of the bass riffage and just overt use of energy, I feel like taps into the sort of punk realm a little better on The Answer, and it sort of keeps that nihilism that's sort of permeating throughout a lot of the lyrics and adds more of the anarchistic mood that permeates throughout some of the more aggressive tendencies on this album, and sort of caps the record off on that foot. that more anarchistic energy is sort of the mood I really wanted to carry following that song too, with Sudden Urge coming after that. A song that sort of lowers the tempo a bit to keep that scale pretty huge, but it paired with Talking to Ourselves After is a point for the album to get super duper catchy, and also giving both sides of the actions that are carrying that emotion that is permeating throughout the lyrics, with Sudden Urge being the sort of call to action, the sort of seeking for anarchy in a sort of punk sort of way, while Talking to Ourselves more feels like the cause leading up to that, you know, feeling like you are all of the plights and actions you've taken before this extreme point felt like they went on deaf ears, and it's a sort of a further enriching of the mood behind the mission statement on the opener, before the real conflict portion of the lyrics sort of comes to the fray, with Monarch, and this time it's personal, coming into the track listing after that. Monarch being an apex of that energy that was sort of throughout parts of Talking to Ourselves and Sudden Urge, more coming to a more aggressive head, while sort of turning out happens in the lyrics. Again, there's a sort of conflict happening across these two songs. It is the moment where one stands up to their oppressor, to embracing their growth from within and their ability to reach this point where they can overthrow a monarch, so to speak, if one is not reading into it literally, considering the more direct political lyrics that crop up throughout parts of this album and could be seen throughout parts of this song. But regardless of that, also, it's a point where I wanted it to get on the attack. You know, it's been a lot of setup and mood, but I wanted to do something with that mood for a couple songs. Which, again, I use its follow-up, this time it's personal, to just double down on that more confrontational energy by being a bit more direct with some of its lines, having some more political ties, especially with the likes of, like, mass shootings being a part of the lyrics of the song. It is a song that also keeps the more punk-laden energy from Monarch just going a bit farther, even if it does lean into some of the post-2008 energy this band had been cooking with for so long. It's got a really good wind down after that energy really carries the listener throughout the song. And I think that it's a really great song from the B-sides that I'm amazed was kind of left on the cutting room floor. On the original, at this point in the album, this sole, real soft moment from this whole era came into the fray. Forfeit, a song that almost feels like an inverse on a lot of the mood, but doubling down on some of the sort of more positive fighting energies that we're seeing throughout parts of Talking Ourselves, a plead for something to be better, something that also crops up throughout Monarch, wanting to save somebody. And it is a really good middle point on Nowhere Generation, and even though I extend mine out one extra song, this is the definitive middle point of these two stretches. And I think that it's a really strong song, and I kind of felt like it needed to be here, not only for just like mood keeping, but again to maximize on that ebb and flow, just to have this focal center point for things to really slow down before spending a couple songs just whirring that engine right back up, with Pain Management and Middle of a Dream coming after that. Pain Management being another song that sort of encroaches on the lyrics that sort of just really miss the mark, in my opinion, like on a song that I scrapped on my version from this Broken Dreams Incorporated, a song that gets a little too direct and just like not subtle with its lyricism. Pain Management at least sort of like keeps that sort of flipped in a sort of way. It feels like the building of intensity from the pleading out into the night that feels like it's emanating from the mood of Forfeit. It sort of feels like the continuation of that mood too. You know, it still has the desire to save somebody, and almost feels like them the not to put this in like an action movie terms, but like the suit up before the final conquest sort of moment, and that sort of gets carried into the song I used to follow it up, Middle of a Dream, a song that goes even harder on the more aggressive punk energy, and goes harder on losing a loved one. It almost feels like the continuation of some of the threads from the last two, but also in parts of Monarch as well. While it's because it sort of has this pleading for things to be different in the same vein as some of those tracks. But I use this as sort of the rise to the climax moment. It's a sort of like payoff from the build-up from Pain Management that I think bleeds well into Rules of Play on the original, but Rules of Play is the closer on the original, and I just don't think it's a good closer whatsoever. It is a solid-ass song, though, and it does have the feeling of like a late-in-the-album cut, so I have it follow Middle of a Dream, because I think it's a good sort of winding into a different direction of the energy while not losing some of the spirit of it in its chorus. It also, again, sort of feels like it's continuing from some of the purging of grief that happens on Middle of a Dream and parts of Pain Management, coming to a sense of ennui, with the song being about sort of reflecting on really revealing some of your own personal demons to somebody else, or one's own trauma to somebody else. It feels like one having purged the pain being the last track, and the sort of emotional sort of change that happens after the fact. It's a nice little sandwich in the album that isn't necessarily the meat of the core of any sort of narrative, but it feels like the closest this album gets. And again, I kind of get what they were going for with it being a closer. I just don't think it's that good of a closer. Instead, I kick that energy up a little bit more one last time with Sounds Like after that, sort of taking that emotional resolve and using any sort of energy one has from being uplifted from that to sort of push for advocating for the future that you want. And in the case of this, potentially not losing somebody to tragedy. But, like, it's a song that sort of reignites a little bit more of that punk energy into the lyrics. It has a bit more advocation for change, a little more directly. It's got a chorus of, like, pleading for the listener to not sit idly by, be the advocate you wish the world had more of. And I think that that's a really good message to have in the world. And I think that as far as being a good moment to sort of transcend the mood from the last couple songs and send the album off on a larger scale, this is the great catalyst for that stretch. Because after that, we go into Last Man Standing, a song that is a really good late in the album cut, sonically speaking. Similarly to Rules of Play, it's just got some use of chords that really feel like it's building up to some sort of finality. It's also got this chorus that sort of feels like it's speaking on a lot of conflict as if it's in the rear view, being the last man standing in this nowhere generation. A really interesting sort of look at the narrator of this record, so to speak, when they, you know, have these themes of grief permeating throughout a lot of the lyrics in the middle portion, and it feels like a sort of just one last boom before the real send-off begins, with the title track coming in, Nowhere Generation, being the sort of like embodiment of the full nines that this album has explored emotionally, encapsulated in one banger-ass showstopper that honestly sounds more like a closer than anything else in this era. Once Last Man Standing sort of fades out, the vocals coming in for the chorus just hit so hard. And it's a good sort of like setup for finale. You know, those whoa-whoas in the chorus really feel like the show-stopping end. You know, there's a lot of big boldness to the sound that feels like the band really trying to recapture that like late 2000s sound and idea that I think works for them. It is a weird point in the original track listing, in my opinion. It should absolutely have been later in the track listing, so I made it the closer in my version. And that's my version of Nowhere Generation. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Would you like to listen to it yourself? Linked in the description is a YouTube link if you would like to spin it. Let me know what you think about it if you do, or this episode if you just watched it. Again, if you liked it, give it a like. If you want to see more, consider subscribing. I drop 2 to 4 vids a week depending on what I've got going on. I'm going to go, though. Thank you again so very much for watching. I've been Viral Wreck. You guys can do this in situations, and I'll see you another day.